Good evening, Shabbat Shalom. Nice to see everybody here this evening. Well, when I think back to my college days, which of course is a long, long time ago, and recently I've been focusing on the early days of my sophomore year when we had the opportunity to join a fraternity. And that engaged us in the process of rushing. Those of you who have done this know you typically go from fraternity to fraternity, or sorority, as the case might be, and you try to discover whether or not this fraternity is for you, as they discover whether or not you are for the fraternity. And I remember asking a close friend of mine something about how one goes about doing this. And he had just one piece of advice for me. He said, just be yourself. And as you might imagine, that raised a question in my mind. Just who am I? And I thought to myself, well, I have a glimpse of who I am, but I don't really know. It's going to take some thinking and some doing. And it got me thinking a little bit about the whole process of personal identity as we try to figure out who we are, either in a static or a dynamic, ever-changing, ever-evolving process. Discovering who we are involves us in self-awareness, in trying to be honest with ourselves, and thinking about our identity, our values, our goals, our aspirations. Can we look into ourselves and recognize our strengths, recognize our weaknesses? Do we have the capacity to, having looked into ourselves with honesty, the capacity to change? Figuring out who I am, who we are, takes work, and it takes courage to be able to see just who we are. And I want to suggest to you that we find this process of the discovery of personal identity in the biblical narrative. Now, I think it's fair to say that the Bible does not engage its characters in great acts of introspection, of looking more deeply into who they are. The Bible rather, and with a great adroitness, helps us to see character through the words of the characters, through their actions, rather than acts of introspection. And no book of the Bible creates in us a sense of character, its qualities, its development, personal identity, than the book of Genesis. And most especially in one of the great epics, we might say, of biblical literature, the story of Joseph and his brothers. We can see the characters reflecting who they are through I statements, I am, and through the equivalent statements, Hineni, here I am, Abraham says on a couple of occasions, and therefore conveys not only who he is, but how he is prepared to act, how he is prepared to think about things. We see it in Rebekah, when Abraham's senior servant goes looking for a wife for Abraham and Sarah's son Isaac, and he happens upon Rebekah, who is engaged in heroic activities, And she takes the senior servant, who's not named, maybe Eliezer, it may not be, into her home where her brother Laban tries to delay her departure, going back with the senior servant to marry Isaac. And at one point he confronts her and he says to her, "Will you go?" And she reveals who she is in one word. She says, "Elech." I will go. I am ready. I am committed to this action. The story of Joseph and his brothers starts off on a very wrong foot, as is famous. Joseph has dreams. He tells them to his brothers. That the brothers are represented by sheaves. And the first dream, Joseph says, "I dreamed that your sheaves were bowing down to my sheaf." And this enraged the brothers. But Joseph doesn't learn his lesson here. He has another dream, and not only does he have this dream, but he dares to tell it to his brothers and to his father, that you are the stars, the sun, the moon, the stars, and all of you bow down to me. And the Torah says the brothers hated Joseph all the more, not only for his dreams, but that he dared to tell them to them. Joseph here reveals who he is. He's a brat. He's a braggart. He's egocentric. He's insensitive to the feelings of others and to the implications of his own actions. For that matter, the brothers are resentful. They're jealous. They're filled with hate. This is not a good start to revealing the better angels of their neighbors. Joseph, of course, comes to us as a dreamer of dreams. And in a way, the dreams give structure to the story of Joseph and his brothers. There are three pairs of dreams. There are his dreams at the beginning. There are the dreams of the butler and the baker in jail, where Joseph resides at the moment. And there are Pharaoh's dreams. Joseph successfully figures out the meaning of the dreams of the butler and the baker. When the Pharaoh himself has a disturbing pair of dreams, the butler and the baker, or at least the butler, I think it's the butler who gets out of jail, the Pharaoh will lift up your head as opposed to the butler, the baker, the Pharaoh will lift off your head. And when the Pharaoh is looking for somebody who can give him satisfactory explanations for his dreams, the butler says, well, there was Joseph. We were with Joseph in prison, and he was able to interpret our dreams successfully because what the interpretation he gave came to pass. And so the Pharaoh calls for Joseph to give a description or a definition, an interpretation of the Pharaoh's dreams. And here's what Joseph says. The Pharaoh said to Joseph, I put you in charge of all the land of Egypt. Not at the right place here. And the Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was rushed from the dungeon. He had his hair cut and changed his clothes, and he appeared before Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream, but no one can interpret it. Now I have heard it said of you that for you to hear a dream is to tell its meaning. And Joseph answered the Pharaoh, saying, not I, Biladai, not I, God will see to Pharaoh's welfare. Here Joseph reveals who he is not, and in language, which points to a kind of self-definition. I am not God. I am not placing myself that high. It is God who is using me as a vessel to interpret the dreams. Joseph here recognizes the limits to who he is. And part of the task of self-definition is to recognize both our powers and our limits. Joseph interprets the dream successfully. He is raised to high power, second only in Egypt to Pharaoh. He enunciates and puts into effect an economic policy, storing grain for the 7 years of plenty, prepared for the 7 years of famine. And the famine affects all of the Middle East, which sends Joseph's brothers down to Egypt to get grain, Egypt being the breadbasket of that region at that point. And they come before Joseph. Joseph recognizes them. After all, this is some 23 years later than when they sent him down to Egypt. He recognizes them, but they do not recognize him. And the Torah says that when Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he acted like a stranger toward them and spoke harshly to them. He asked them, "Where do you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan to procure food." For though Joseph recognized his brothers, they didn't recognize him. Recalling the dreams that he had dreamed about them, Joseph said, "You are spies. You have come to see the land in its nakedness." But they said to him, "No, my lord, truly your servants have come to procure food. We are all of us sons of the same man. We are honest men. Your servants have never been spies." Notice that Jacob speaks very harshly to them. Why? As the Torah points out, he recalled his dreams. Joseph here holds on to the past. He has resentments. He feels angry toward his brothers, and he cannot, some quarter of a century later, let them go. This has something to do with who we might be. We might be the kind of person who cannot let go of the past, who allows the anger, the strong emotions to define ourselves way long into the future. But then when the brothers come down a second time, and Joseph threatens to hold on to Benjamin, Judah gives a magnificent speech in which he appeals to Joseph on the basis of feelings for their father. And I'm just going to read the very last verse of Judah's eloquent speech. "For how can I go back to my father unless the boy is with me? Let me not be witness to the woe that would overtake our father." This ought to remind us of something that happens way back at the beginning of the story. In chapter 37, beginning with verse 32. This is when they have thrown Joseph in the pit and sold him to traders passing by. The brothers had the ornamented tunic taken to their father, and they said to him, after all, they'll have to explain why Joseph isn't with them, "We found this. Please examine it. Is it your son's tunic or not?" Jacob recognized it and said, "My son's tunic, a savage beast has devoured him. Joseph was torn by a beast." So Jacob rented his clothes, put sackcloth on his loins, and observed mourning for his son for many days. Back at the beginning, the brothers were willing to terrify their father, to offer an excuse, a reason for why Joseph is no longer with them. And they seemed indifferent to their father's pain. but they have changed. And I'm going to read again the last sentence of Judah's great speech to Joseph. For how can I go back to my father unless the boy is with me? Let me not be a witness to the woe that would overtake my father. You can see how subtle the Torah's line of narrative development is here. It doesn't say, the author doesn't say, Judah has changed. It just reflects on the two kinds of statements that the brothers made earlier and now. They have grown to empathize with the father that they allowed to suffer some years before. And so the Torah goes on to say that Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone withdraw from me." So there was no one else about when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. His sobs were so loud that the Egyptians could hear, and so the news reached Pharaoh's palace. And Joseph now makes an I am statement, a statement of self-identification. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still well?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dumbfounded were they on account of him. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come forward to me," and now he adds to this I am statement. And when they came forward, he said, not what he just said a moment ago, "I am Joseph." He adds something to this. "I am your brother, Joseph, he whom you sold into Egypt." He acknowledges that he is their brother, not just descriptively, but also emotionally. "I am ready to rejoin you as one of the brothers." So moved was he by the move of Judah to exhibit a new empathy for their common father. Here we are watching development. Joseph goes on, "Do not be distressed or reproach yourselves because you sold me hither. It was to save life that God sent me ahead of you. It is now 2 years that there has been famine in the land, and there are still 5 years to come. God has sent me ahead of you to ensure your survival on earth." Think of what Joseph has done here. Maybe he believes what he has just said, and maybe he doesn't, because he tells them a narrative of what has transpired in terms of what it really means. "You acted harshly, hatefully to me." But that's not the true explanation of what has transpired. This is God's doing in order to send me down to Egypt to be able to rise to power, to bring you and your family down here to save you. He gives them what Aviva Zornberg calls a therapeutic narrative, a narrative of generosity of spirit to help to mollify their guilt and to tell them, really, you may have meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And then finally, in this evening's Torah portion, as Rabbi Cohn mentioned earlier, we conclude the book of Genesis this evening. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us?" They themselves still hold on to the guilt for which Joseph has tried to forgive them. "This was not exactly your story," he told them. "This is God's story in which you're playing a salvational role But no, they cannot, as is true for most of us some of the time. We cannot free ourselves from the guilt which in some ways paralyze us. And I think the Torah is suggesting here that just as we are forgiven by others, we ought to be able to forgive ourselves, all the more fully to express who we are and who we can be. What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrong that we did him? So they sent this message to Joseph. Now, the message is not true. Before his death, your father left this instruction. So shall you say to Joseph, forgive, I urge you, the offense and the guilt of your brothers who treated you so harshly. But this can't be true because Jacob never knows what the true story of Joseph's disappearance was. They're making up this story in order to try to find a way to get out of the predicament they still feel they are in. Therefore, they go on, please forgive the offense of the servants of the God of your father. And Joseph was in tears as they spoke to him. It would take us a while to try to figure out what is the cause of those tears. Does he feel sorrow for them that they are still holding on to this guilt? Does he recognize the pathos of their own situation? His brothers then went to him themselves. They flung themselves before him and said, we are prepared to be your slaves. But Joseph said to them, have no fear. Am I a substitute for God? Besides, although you intended me harm, God intended it for good. He feels the need to tell them this once again, so as to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. And here comes one of the most powerful lines in all of biblical literature. And so, fear not, I will sustain you and your children. Now, we may recall way back at the beginning of Genesis, in the first parsha, the first portion, that Cain, having killed Abel, says, am I my brother's keeper? With the implication, no, I am not. And one of the great themes of the book of Genesis is precisely this. Is a brother the keeper of his brother or his sister? Sibling rivalry is one of the major motifs. The author in the final chapter of the book of Genesis gives the author's answer to this question through the words and the emotions of Joseph. And so fear not, I will sustain you, my brothers, and your children. I intend to be my brother's keeper. And the biblical author, I want to suggest, has that Cain and Abel story ringing in his mind as he comes to round off the arc of this great narrative. The story raises questions for us. Do we insist on bringing the past into the present and find ourselves paralyzed in one way or another by either anger or resentment or guilt? Can we, like Joseph and his brothers, change? Can we grow? Is personal identity a dynamic phenomenon? And what about our words and our actions? What do they reveal about us, about our personal identity, about our character, about who we are? The Torah's story in Genesis is a great narrative of personal self-discovery and a recognition of the capacities, the potential that all of us have within us. If only we would have the courage to look within, to forgive ourselves for our faults so that we can grow, and to recognize the ways in which we can be our brothers, our sisters, our fellow citizens. We can be their keeper. Amen.